I still remember the exact moment I realized the man I would have taken a bullet for was the same man holding the gun. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of unremarkable day that you never expect to shatter your entire world. I was sitting in my home office, the rain drumming against the window of our modest terraced house in Manchester, and I was staring at a document on my screen that made no sense. My name was on it, my signature, but I had never seen this document before in my life. And according to what I was reading, I had just authorized the transfer of £240,000 from a client trust account to an offshore entity I had never heard of. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the pages. Each line felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest, because I knew in that moment with a certainty that made me physically sick that someone had forged my signature. Someone had used my credentials. Someone had set me up to take the fall for something I never did. And there was only one person in the entire company who had the access, the motive, and the opportunity to do this. Rick Thornton, my boss, my mentor, the man who had plucked me from obscurity 7 years earlier and turned me into his right hand, the man I had trusted more than my own father, the man who had stood as best man at my wedding and held my daughter for the first time just hours after she was born. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how deep this betrayal cut, you need to understand how it all began. You need to see the relationship I thought we had, the bond I believed was unbreakable. Because the cruelest betrayals do not come from enemies. They come from the people who sleep in the room next to yours, who eat at your table, who know every weakness you have and every dream you hold dear. They come from the people you love. I grew up in Salford, in a council flat with my mum and 2 younger sisters after my dad walked out when I was 11. We had nothing. I mean nothing. There were weeks when my mum would skip meals so we could eat. There were winters when we wore our coats indoors because we could not afford to heat the flat properly. Education was my only way out, and I clung to it like a lifeline. I studied while my mates were out causing trouble. I got a scholarship to a decent school, then worked 3 jobs to put myself through university. I graduated with a first-class degree in finance and accounting, and I thought that was my ticket to a better life. But the world does not work that way, does it? Having a degree means nothing if you do not have connections. I applied for hundreds of jobs. I got rejection after rejection. Companies wanted experience I did not have, or they wanted people who came from the right families, went to the right schools, knew the right people. I was nobody from nowhere, and the doors stayed firmly closed. I was 27 years old, working as a junior clerk at a struggling accounting firm in Stockport, earning barely enough to cover my rent when I first met Richard Thornton. He came into our office for a meeting with one of the senior partners, and I happened to be the one who brought him coffee. He was everything I was not. Tall, impeccably dressed, confident in a way that seemed effortless. He had this presence about him, this gravity that made everyone in the room pay attention. He was the managing director of Thornton Blackwood Financial Consulting, one of the most respected firms in the Northwest. They handled wealth management, corporate restructuring, and investment portfolios for clients worth millions. I did not expect him to notice me. I was just the kid with the coffee. But as I set the cup down, he looked at me properly. He asked my name. He asked where I had studied. And when I told him about my degree, my background, my struggle to break into the industry, he did not look at me with pity or condescension. He looked at me with something that felt like recognition. 3 days later, I received a phone call. It was from his personal assistant, offering me an interview at Thornton Blackwood. I thought it was a mistake at first, or maybe a cruel joke. But I went anyway, wearing a suit I had borrowed from a mate because I could not afford my own. I sat in that gleaming glass conference room overlooking the Manchester skyline, and I poured my heart out. I told Rick everything, where I came from, what I wanted to become, how hard I was willing to work. And he listened. He really listened. He offered me a position that same day, junior financial analyst with a salary that was more than double what I was earning. I nearly cried right there in his office. He shook my hand and said something I will never forget. He said, "I see myself in you, Daniel. I came from nothing too. Someone gave me a chance when no one else would, and now I am going to do the same for you. Work hard, stay loyal, and I promise you the sky is the limit." I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. Those first few years were everything I had dreamed of. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I was the first one in every morning and the last one out every night. I studied the portfolios, learned the systems, memorized every detail of every client account. I made myself indispensable. And Rick noticed. He always noticed. He promoted me to senior analyst within 2 years, then to portfolio manager, then to associate director. Each promotion came with a bigger salary, better benefits, more responsibility. My life transformed completely. Sarah and I got married in a beautiful ceremony at a country house in Cheshire, and Rick gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. He called me the son he never had. He said I was the future of the company. When our daughter Emma was born 3 years later, he showed up at the hospital with champagne and a cashmere blanket that probably cost more than my first car. I loved him. Not in a romantic way, obviously, but in the way you love a father who actually shows up for you. He was the mentor I never had, the role model I desperately needed. He taught me how to negotiate, how to read people, how to command a room. He invited Sarah and me to his house for dinner parties, introduced us to his wife Catherine and their 2 teenagers. We spent Christmas together. We went on holiday together. Our families became intertwined in ways that felt permanent and beautiful. By the time I turned 32, I was the youngest director in the history of Thornton Blackwood. I managed a portfolio worth over £40 million. I had a reputation in the industry as someone who got results, and I owed all of it to Rick. He had given me everything. He had believed in me when no one else would, and I repaid that faith with absolute, unwavering loyalty. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs I was too blind to notice at the time. There were moments that should have made me pause, questions I should have asked, patterns I should have recognized. But when you love someone, when you trust someone completely, you make excuses, you rationalize, you convince yourself that the red flags are just shadows, tricks of the light, nothing to worry about. The first sign came about 4 years into my time at the company. We were handling a major restructuring deal for a manufacturing company in Birmingham, and I noticed some discrepancies in the financial projections we were presenting to the client. The numbers did not add up. There were inconsistencies that suggested someone had manipulated the data to make the investment look more attractive than it actually was. I brought it to Rick privately, expecting him to be concerned, expecting him to launch an investigation. Instead, he laughed. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me I was overthinking things. He said that in our business, sometimes you had to be creative with the numbers to close a deal. He said the projections were aspirational rather than literal. He told me to trust him, that this was how the game was played at the highest levels, and that my job was to execute, not to question. I did not like it. Something felt wrong in my gut. But I told myself he knew better than I did. He had decades of experience. He understood the industry in ways I was still learning, so I pushed my doubts aside and focused on the work. The deal went through, the client was happy, everyone got their bonuses, and I convinced myself that everything was fine. There were other moments too, times when Rick would take a call and leave the room, speaking in hushed tones that did not match his usual confident demeanor. Times when certain files would be marked as restricted, accessible only to him and a handful of senior partners I had never met. Times when clients would ask questions about their accounts that I could not answer because I did not have the full picture. I noticed that Rick had a habit of taking on certain clients personally, keeping them separate from the rest of the firm's operations. He called them his special projects, legacy relationships from his early days in the business. He said they required a personal touch, a level of confidentiality that precluded the usual oversight. I never questioned it. Why would I? He was Rick Thornton, the man who had built this empire from scratch, the man who had given me everything. The real trouble started about 18 months before that fateful Tuesday evening. The financial markets had been volatile, and several of our clients had suffered significant losses. It was not our fault, just the nature of the industry, but some clients were unhappy. There were complaints, threats of lawsuits, demands for explanations. The pressure on the firm was immense, and I could see it taking a toll on Rick. He became shorter-tempered, more secretive, more prone to disappearing for hours without explanation. Around the same time, I noticed that my access to certain systems had been quietly expanded. Files I could not view before suddenly appeared in my directories. Accounts I had never managed were added to my portfolio without any formal discussion or documentation. When I asked Rick about it, he said the firm was restructuring internally, redistributing responsibilities to prepare for growth. He said he was grooming me to take over more of the day-to-day operations so he could focus on strategy and new business development. I was flattered. I interpreted it as a sign of trust, more evidence that he was preparing me to eventually succeed him. I threw myself into the expanded role with the same dedication I had always shown. I worked longer hours, took on more responsibilities, proved again and again that his faith in me was justified. I did not realize he was building a trap. I did not understand that every new access privilege, every additional responsibility, every glowing word of praise was another bar in the cage he was constructing around me. I did not see that I was being positioned not as his successor, but as his scapegoat. The first undeniable crack appeared about 6 months before everything fell apart. A client named Harold Pemberton, a retired surgeon who had entrusted his entire life savings to our firm, came into the office demanding to speak with someone about his account. His portfolio had supposedly suffered catastrophic losses, and he had received a statement showing his balance had dropped by nearly 60%. He was devastated, on the verge of tears, talking about how he would not be able to afford his wife's care home fees, how their retirement was ruined. I pulled up his account to review the situation, and what I found made no sense. According to our records, his portfolio had not suffered any unusual losses. The investments were performing within normal parameters. There was no explanation for the statement he had received. When I showed him the discrepancy, he became confused and then angry. He had documentation, he said. He had received official correspondence from the firm detailing the losses and recommending additional investments to recover his position. I asked to see the correspondence. The letters he showed me looked authentic. They had our letterhead, our formatting, our standard language. But I had never seen them before, and the account activity they described did not match our internal records. Someone had been sending this man fraudulent statements. Someone had been manipulating his perception of his own finances. I took the matter to Rick immediately. I expected him to be outraged, to launch a full investigation, to contact the authorities. Instead, he became very quiet, very calm. He told me to leave the documents with him and to say nothing to anyone until he had a chance to look into it personally. He said there had to be a simple explanation, probably just an administrative error or a technical glitch. He told me to send Harold home with reassurances and to leave the rest to him. 2 days later, Harold Pemberton withdrew his entire account and transferred to a different firm. Rick told me he had personally resolved the situation, that it had been a miscommunication, and that the client had decided to move on for unrelated reasons. He said I had handled it well and that I should not give it another thought. But I could not stop thinking about it. Something was wrong. The pieces did not fit. Why would Harold leave after discovering his account was actually fine? Why would Rick be so eager to handle it personally and keep it quiet? What had actually happened to prompt those fraudulent statements in the first place? I should have pushed harder. I should have demanded answers. But I was afraid. Not of Rick. Not yet, but of what the answers might reveal. I had built my entire life on the foundation of this company, this relationship, this trust. If that foundation was rotten, everything would collapse. My career, my identity, my sense of who I was and what I had achieved. So I did what humans do when the truth is too terrifying to face. I looked away. I told myself there had to be an innocent explanation. I buried my doubts and went back to work. The next few months passed in a kind of willful blindness. I focused on my clients, my responsibilities, my family. Sarah and I celebrated Emma's 4th birthday with a party in our garden. I got a raise and a bonus that allowed us to start saving for a bigger house. On the surface, everything was perfect, but underneath, something had shifted. I found myself watching Rick more carefully, noticing things I had never noticed before. The way he would suddenly change the subject when certain topics came up, the nervous energy that crackled around him during particular phone calls, the increasing frequency with which he would work late, alone, after everyone else had gone home. I started keeping notes, not formally, not with any real purpose in mind, just mental notes of things that seemed odd, clients who disappeared from our roster without explanation, transactions that bypassed normal approval processes, meetings that happened behind closed doors with people I did not recognize. I told myself I was being paranoid, that stress was making me see conspiracies where there were none. But the notes accumulated, and the pattern became harder to ignore. Then came Marcus Webb. Marcus was our head of IT, a quiet man in his early 40s who had been with the company almost as long as I had. He was the kind of person who faded into the background, who people tended to overlook because he never drew attention to himself. He did his job, fixed the servers, maintained the systems, and went home to his wife and cats. I had never had a real conversation with him beyond basic pleasantries. One evening, about 3 months before everything exploded, I was working late on a client presentation. The office was mostly empty, just a few other dedicated souls burning the midnight oil. I went to the break room to get a coffee, and I found Marcus sitting alone at a table, staring at his phone with an expression I can only describe as haunted. I asked if he was okay. It was just a polite question, the kind of thing you say to a colleague without really expecting an answer. But Marcus looked up at me with eyes that held something desperate, something that needed to escape. He asked if he could trust me. The question caught me off guard. I said, of course, that we had worked together for years, that I considered him a friend. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. Then he said something that planted the first real seed of suspicion in my mind. He said, "Daniel, I have seen things I should not have seen, and I do not know what to do about them." I sat down across from him and asked what he meant. He shook his head, suddenly looking frightened. He said he could not talk about it here, that the walls had ears, that he needed time to figure out what to do. But he made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would remember this conversation. He made me promise that I would not just accept the official story. I tried to press him for more details, but he shut down completely. He said he had already said too much, that he needed to be careful. He gathered his things and left, and I sat there in the break room with my coffee growing cold, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next day, Marcus called in sick. The day after that, Rick announced in a staff meeting that Marcus had decided to pursue other opportunities and had left the company effective immediately. He thanked Marcus for his years of service and welcomed our new IT director, a young woman named Jessica, who had apparently been hired over the weekend. I tried to reach Marcus at his home number. No answer. I sent emails to his personal address. They bounced back undelivered. I even drove to the address we had on file for him, but the house was dark and empty, with a for sale sign in the front garden. Marcus Webb had vanished, and no one else at the company seemed to find this strange or worth questioning. I became more careful after that. I stopped making mental notes and started making real ones, documented in a private file on my personal laptop at home. I began paying closer attention to the systems I had access to, looking for anomalies, inconsistencies, anything that might explain what Marcus had been trying to tell me. And slowly, piece by piece, a terrible picture began to emerge. There was a pattern in the client accounts I had been given access to. Not all of them, but certain ones. High-value clients, mostly elderly, mostly without close family members to monitor their finances. Their accounts showed steady, healthy returns in all the official reports. But when I dug deeper, when I compared the actual transaction histories with the statements being sent to clients, the numbers did not match. Money was being moved in ways that made no sense. Investments were being liquidated without authorization. Funds were trickling out through a maze of transfers that eventually disappeared into entities with names I did not recognize. Someone was stealing from our clients. Not obviously, not dramatically, but systematically in small enough amounts that no one would notice unless they were looking very carefully. And the digital fingerprints on these transactions, the authorization codes, the electronic signatures, all of them traced back to accounts with my credentials. I felt sick as the reality crystallized in my mind. I was being framed. Every irregular transaction, every unauthorized transfer, every instance of fraud bore my digital signature. If anyone ever investigated, if any of these clients ever discovered what was happening and went to the authorities, all the evidence would point directly at me. Daniel Mercer, the grateful protege who had been given everything and had secretly been stealing from vulnerable people for years. And there was only one person with the power to set this up. Only one person with access to my credentials, control over the systems, authority over which clients I managed. Only one person who had been systematically giving me more and more access to exactly the accounts being defrauded. Rick Thornton. My mentor. My father figure. The man I loved and trusted more than anyone outside my own family. He had spent years building me up specifically so he could tear me down. He had given me everything so that when the time came, he could take everything away. The realization did not come as a sudden lightning bolt. It crept over me slowly, like a cold tide rising around my ankles, then my knees, then my chest. Each new piece of evidence made the picture clearer and more devastating. I remember the exact moment when denial became impossible, when I could no longer pretend there was an innocent explanation. It was late on a Thursday night, maybe 2 weeks before the document that started this story would appear on my screen. Sarah and Emma were asleep upstairs, and I was in my home office, going through the records I had been secretly compiling. I had created a timeline of all the suspicious transactions, cross-referenced with the access logs, the internal communications, the client correspondence, and as I stared at the complete picture, the pattern was undeniable. The fraud had started almost exactly when Rick began expanding my access. Every new responsibility I was given came with exposure to another compromised account. The clients being targeted were precisely the ones Rick had identified as special relationships, requiring his personal oversight. And the offshore entities receiving the stolen funds shared naming conventions and registration dates that suggested they were all connected, all part of the same hidden network. I sat there in the dark, lit only by the glow of my laptop screen, and I cried. Not gentle, quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. I was mourning not just my career, not just my future, but the death of something more fundamental, the death of a relationship I had believed was sacred, the death of a trust I had thought was unbreakable, the death of the man I had thought Rick was, replaced by a monster I did not recognize. Sarah found me like that, having been woken by the sounds of my grief. She came downstairs in her dressing gown, took one look at my face, and held me without asking any questions. She just held me while I cried, and when I was finally empty, when there was nothing left but exhaustion and a terrible clarity, she asked me to tell her everything. So I did. I showed her the records, explained the patterns, walked her through the evidence. She listened with growing horror, her hand tight on mine, her face pale in the dim light. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said the words that changed everything. She said, "Daniel, you have two choices. You can go to the authorities right now, tell them what you have found, and hope they believe you. Or you can fight back. You can gather enough evidence to prove not just your innocence, but his guilt. You can make sure that when this all comes out, there is no possible way for him to escape justice." I asked her what she thought I should do. She looked me in the eyes with an intensity I had never seen from her before. She said, "He took everything from you, your trust, your career, your reputation. He was going to let you go to prison for crimes he committed. He was going to destroy our family without a second thought. So I think you should destroy him, completely, systematically, in a way he never sees coming. I think you should make him pay for every single thing he has done." In that moment, looking at my wife, seeing the fierce protective love in her eyes, I felt something new kindle in my chest. Not despair anymore, not grief. Something harder, something colder, something that would sustain me through the months of careful planning and patient execution that lay ahead. Resolve, determination, and yes, I will admit it, a deep, burning hunger for revenge. The next morning, I went to work with a smile on my face and murder in my heart. I greeted Rick warmly, accepted his praise for a recent client presentation, laughed at his jokes over lunch. I was the perfect protege, the loyal right hand, the son he never had. And behind my eyes, I was planning his destruction. But I knew I had to be careful. Rick was smart, experienced, connected. He had been manipulating people for decades. If he sensed even a hint of suspicion from me, he would accelerate his plans, throw me to the wolves immediately, and disappear with whatever he had managed to steal. I needed time to gather evidence, build my case, ensure that when I struck, there would be no possible escape for him. So I played the long game. I continued my secret investigation, documenting everything, backing up files to secure locations he did not know about. I reached out very carefully to some of the clients who had been defrauded, not revealing what I knew, but asking subtle questions that confirmed my suspicions. I tracked down Marcus Webb's wife through social media and learned that he and his wife had suddenly moved to Portugal, claiming early retirement, which seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. I also began reaching out to people within the financial regulatory community, establishing relationships, understanding how investigations worked, learning what evidence would be most compelling. I did this under the guise of professional development, attending conferences and networking events, never revealing my true purpose. I was building the infrastructure for Rick's downfall, piece by piece, invisible and inexorable. Meanwhile, Rick continued his scheme, oblivious to the fact that his perfect patsy was now watching his every move. I observed as he added 2 more elderly clients to my portfolio, both widowers with substantial assets and no children to ask uncomfortable questions. I saw the familiar pattern beginning again, the small discrepancies, the unauthorized transfers, the carefully forged documentation. And I let it happen, documenting everything, gathering more evidence for the reckoning to come. It was during this period that I discovered the full extent of Rick's operation. He was not just stealing from clients, he was running a sophisticated fraud that had been operating for at least 15 years, predating my arrival at the company by nearly a decade. The offshore entities I had identified were part of a network that stretched across multiple jurisdictions, designed to make the money virtually untraceable. The total amount stolen, based on my conservative estimates, was somewhere north of £30 million. I also discovered that I was not his first scapegoat. There had been another young employee, a woman named Catherine Shaw, who had worked at the firm about 5 years before I joined. She had been Rick's previous protégé, his previous rising star, and when some of the early fraud had threatened to come to light, she had suddenly been fired for cause, accused of stealing from clients, her career destroyed before she could defend herself. She had tried to fight back, had claimed she was framed, but without evidence. Without resources, without anyone willing to believe her over the respected Richard Thornton, she had lost everything. Last I could find, she was working as a bookkeeper in Glasgow, having never recovered from the accusation. Learning about Catherine changed something in me. My revenge was no longer just about protecting myself and my family. It was about justice for her too. For Marcus, who had clearly discovered something and been forced to flee. For Harold Pemberton and all the other clients who had been systematically robbed by a man they trusted. For everyone Rick Thornton had ever used and discarded in his relentless pursuit of wealth. I made contact with Catherine Shaw, carefully and anonymously at first. I sent her a letter explaining that I believed she had been framed, that I had evidence that might vindicate her, and that I wanted to help if she was willing to talk. The response I received was heartbreaking. She had spent years trying to convince people of her innocence, only to be dismissed as bitter and delusional. She had lost her marriage, her home, her professional reputation. The accusations had followed her everywhere, making it nearly impossible to rebuild her life. But she had never stopped believing that one day the truth would come out. She had kept her own records, her own documentation, her own evidence of the discrepancies she had noticed before her termination. She had been waiting, hoping, praying for someone to finally listen. I promised her that I was listening, and I promised her that when I brought Rick Thornton down, I would make sure the world knew she had been innocent all along. The months passed, and my evidence file grew thicker. I had transaction records, access logs, internal communications, client testimonies, regulatory filings, corporate registration documents. I had traced the offshore entities to their beneficial owners, hidden behind layers of shell companies but ultimately connected to accounts that Rick controlled. I had documented his patterns, his methods, his digital fingerprints on every aspect of the fraud. I also prepared my defense. I gathered evidence proving that my credentials had been used without my knowledge, that the authorization protocols had been manipulated, that the security systems had been deliberately compromised to allow impersonation. I documented the timeline of my access changes, showing how each new privilege corresponded to a new phase of the fraud. I created a narrative that was not just about my innocence, but about Rick's systematic scheme to use me as his fall guy. Through it all, I maintained my facade at work. I smiled, I performed, I earned Rick's continued praise and trust. He had no idea that his carefully constructed trap was about to snap shut on his own neck instead of mine. Then came the Tuesday evening that began this story. The document with my forged signature, authorizing a massive transfer I had never approved. It was the trigger I had been waiting for, the moment when Rick's scheme entered its final phase. He was preparing to make me take the fall, probably planning to fire me within days, call in the regulators, and watch as I was dragged away in handcuffs while he played the shocked, betrayed mentor. But I was ready. After months of preparation, I had everything I needed, and the next morning I set my plan in motion. I did not go to work that day. Instead, I went to see a woman named Victoria Ashford. Victoria was a member of the Thornton Blackwood Board of Directors, one of the original investors who had helped fund the company's expansion 2 decades earlier. She was also, according to everything I had learned about her, a person of genuine integrity in an industry not known for it. She had a reputation for ethical conduct and for holding companies accountable when they strayed from proper standards. I had requested a meeting with her through formal channels, claiming I wanted to discuss my career development and the future direction of the company. When I arrived at her elegant townhouse in Kensington, she greeted me warmly, clearly expecting a routine professional conversation. What she got instead was a 2-hour presentation that left her visibly shaken. I laid out everything: the fraud, the pattern, the evidence, my role as the unwitting scapegoat. I showed her the documents, the timelines, the transaction trails. I told her about Catherine Shaw, about Marcus Webb, about the clients who had been robbed of their life savings. And I told her about the document that had appeared on my screen the previous evening, the trigger for whatever Rick was planning next. Victoria listened without interrupting, her face growing more grave with each revelation. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. She asked why I was coming to her instead of going directly to the authorities. I was honest with her. I said that the evidence pointed to me. Every digital signature, every authorization code, every paper trail led to my credentials. If I went to the police without someone inside the company to corroborate my story, without someone with power and credibility to vouch for my character, I would be arrested, tried, and convicted before anyone believed a word I said. Rick had constructed his trap too well. My only hope was to have allies who could verify the truth, who could ensure that the investigation went in the right direction instead of the convenient one. Victoria considered this for a long time. Then she said something that changed everything. She said, "Daniel, I have had concerns about Richard for years. Small things, intuitions, nothing I could ever prove. But I have always felt that something was not quite right. I think you are telling me the truth, and I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed." She explained that Rick had powerful friends, connections in the regulatory agencies, relationships with law firms that would make a straightforward investigation difficult. If we wanted to bring him down, we needed to be strategic. We needed to catch him in the act, on camera, on record, in a way that left absolutely no room for doubt or denial. Over the next several hours, Victoria and I developed a plan. It was risky, complex, and required perfect timing. But if it worked, it would not only destroy Rick Thornton, it would exonerate me completely and expose his entire operation for the world to see. The plan hinged on a simple fact. Rick did not know I was on to him. He still thought I was his loyal protege, his perfect patsy, oblivious to the noose being tightened around my neck. He would continue his scheme, confident that everything was going according to his design, and that overconfidence would be his undoing. Victoria would convene an emergency board meeting, ostensibly to discuss the company's quarterly performance and future strategy. Rick would be required to attend, to present the financials, to account for the firm's operations. And during that meeting, I would present my evidence directly to the full board, with Victoria's support and with legal counsel standing by. But before that happened, we needed to ensure that the authorities were already involved, that an investigation was already underway, that Rick could not simply dismiss my accusations or use his connections to bury the inquiry. Victoria knew people at the Financial Conduct Authority, people she trusted to handle this properly. She would reach out to them, confidentially, and lay the groundwork for what was to come. We also needed to ensure that Rick could not destroy evidence once he realized what was happening. Victoria arranged for an independent IT security firm to be on standby, ready to secure the company's servers the moment the board meeting began. Everything would be preserved, every file, every email, every transaction record. There would be nowhere for Rick to hide. The board meeting was scheduled for exactly 2 weeks later. 2 weeks of maintaining my cover, of smiling at the man who was trying to destroy me, of pretending everything was normal while my heart pounded with anticipation and fear. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. Every day I went to work and performed my role flawlessly. I attended meetings, managed clients, submitted reports. I had lunch with Rick, listened to his war stories, laughed at his jokes. And every night I went home to Sarah and updated her on our progress, checked in with Victoria, refined our plan. During this period, Rick made his move. He called me into his office one afternoon, his face a mask of grave concern. He said there had been irregularities discovered in some client accounts, serious discrepancies that were currently being investigated internally. He said that unfortunately, some of the evidence pointed to my credentials having been used for unauthorized transactions. I watched his performance with new eyes, seeing for the first time the skill with which he manipulated and deceived. His concern seemed so genuine, his reluctance to believe I was involved so convincing. He was a masterful actor, and for 7 years I had been completely fooled by his performance. He said he was sure there was an innocent explanation. He said he would do everything in his power to protect me, to get to the bottom of what had happened, but he also said that given the seriousness of the allegations, he had no choice but to place me on administrative leave pending the completion of the internal investigation. He said it was for my own protection, to ensure that no one could accuse him of bias or impropriety in how the matter was handled. I nodded. expressed appropriate shock and gratitude, and allowed myself to be escorted from the building by security. It was humiliating, walking past my colleagues with my personal effects in a cardboard box, seeing the mixture of confusion and suspicion on their faces, but I held my head high because I knew something they did not. This was not my defeat. This was Rick's final mistake. By placing me on administrative leave, Rick had given me exactly what I needed: freedom to coordinate with Victoria without the pressure of maintaining my cover at work, time to finalize our preparations, and crucially, evidence of his consciousness of guilt. He was moving against me because he was afraid of what I might discover, what I might reveal. His actions proved he had something to hide. The day of the board meeting arrived. I woke before dawn, my stomach churning with nervous energy. Sarah held me close for a long moment before I left, whispering words of love and encouragement. Emma, not understanding what was happening but sensing its importance, hugged my leg and told me to have a good day at work. I arrived at the Thornton Blackwood offices at precisely 9:45, 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. The security guard at the front desk looked uncomfortable when he saw me, clearly having been told I was not supposed to be on the premises. But I showed him the official summons I had received from the board secretary, requesting my presence at the meeting, and he had no choice but to let me through. The boardroom was on the top floor of the building, a glass-walled space with panoramic views of the Manchester skyline. When I entered, most of the board members were already seated around the long mahogany table. Victoria caught my eye and gave me an almost imperceptible nod. The lawyers were in position, the IT security team was standing by. Everything was ready. Rick arrived last, striding into the room with his usual confident energy. He froze when he saw me sitting at the table, his face flickering through surprise, confusion, and then something darker before settling into a carefully neutral expression. He asked what I was doing here. He reminded the board that I was on administrative leave, that I should not be present for discussions involving my alleged misconduct. He said my presence was inappropriate and potentially prejudicial to the ongoing investigation. Victoria spoke before anyone else could respond. She said that my presence had been specifically requested by the board, that there were matters to be discussed which required my participation, and that Rick should take his seat so we could proceed. I watched Rick carefully as he processed this information. I could see him calculating, trying to understand what was happening, how his carefully constructed narrative had been disrupted. But he was too experienced, too practiced, to show panic openly. He smiled, shrugged, and took his seat at the head of the table. The first hour of the meeting proceeded normally, covering quarterly finances, client retention rates, projected growth. Rick presented his reports with smooth confidence, answering questions, deflecting concerns, playing his role perfectly. I waited, patient and still, knowing my moment would come. Then Victoria called for a motion to add a new item to the agenda, an item concerning allegations of serious financial misconduct within the organization. The motion was seconded, and despite Rick's visible discomfort, it was approved by a majority of the board. Victoria turned to me and asked if I would please present my findings to the board. The next 2 hours were the most important of my professional life. I stood at the front of that room and laid out everything I had discovered. I showed them the pattern of fraud, the offshore entities, the manipulated accounts. I showed them my forged signatures, the unauthorized access to my credentials, the systematic setup that had been designed to make me take the fall. I showed them the evidence of Catherine Shaw's wrongful termination, the suspicious departure of Marcus Webb, the trail of victims that stretched back over a decade. As I spoke, I watched Rick's face. The mask of calm slowly cracked, revealing the fear and fury beneath. He interrupted constantly, objecting, denying, trying to cast doubt on my evidence and my motivations. But I had prepared for every objection. For every claim he made, I had documentation. For every denial, I had proof. The climax came when I presented the final piece of evidence, a recording, made secretly by Marcus Webb before his departure, of a conversation between him and Rick. In the recording, Rick explicitly discussed the fraud, named the accounts being targeted, and talked about the need to eliminate anyone who might become a problem. He spoke about me by name, laughing about how perfectly I had played my role as the unsuspecting patsy. He said I was the perfect fall guy because I was too grateful, too loyal, too trusting to ever see what was right in front of my face. Marcus had given this recording to his wife with instructions to release it if anything ever happened to him. She had held on to it for months, waiting for someone to emerge who could use it properly. Catherine Shaw had connected us, completing the chain that led to Rick's destruction. The room was utterly silent as the recording played. When it ended, Rick stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His face was white, his hands shaking. He looked around the table at the board members, at the lawyers, at me, and he must have seen that there was no escape. The trap he had built for me had closed around him instead. He tried to run. He actually tried to run for the door, like a common criminal in a police procedural. But the authorities were already waiting in the hallway. Victoria had coordinated with the Financial Conduct Authority, and they had officers positioned throughout the building, ready to act as soon as the evidence was presented. I stood at the window and watched as Richard Thornton was led out of the building he had built, handcuffed, surrounded by investigators, his empire crumbling around him, the man who had been my mentor, my father figure, the architect of everything I thought I had achieved, the man who had tried to destroy me without a moment's hesitation or a flicker of conscience. I felt many things in that moment. Relief, certainly, vindication, a grim satisfaction that justice was finally being served, but also grief. Despite everything, despite knowing the truth about who he really was, part of me still mourned the relationship I had lost. The mentor I thought I had, the bond I had believed was real. Even though it had all been a lie, the loss still hurt. The aftermath unfolded over the following months. Rick was charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and related offenses. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his connections could not save him. He eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges in exchange for cooperation, but even so, he was sentenced to 14 years in prison. His assets were seized, his reputation destroyed, his family scattered. Everything he had built, everything he had stolen, everything he had manipulated into existence collapsed into dust. Catherine Shaw was publicly exonerated. The firm issued a formal apology and a substantial settlement for her wrongful termination. She called me the day after the story broke, crying, barely able to speak, thanking me for giving her back something she had thought was lost forever. Her innocence, her name, her truth. The clients who had been defrauded were identified and, where possible, compensated. It was not a perfect outcome. Some of the money had disappeared completely, vanished into the maze of offshore accounts that Rick had constructed. Some of the victims had already passed away, never knowing what had been stolen from them. But for many, there was at least partial restitution, and more importantly, there was acknowledgement of what had been done to them. Marcus Webb returned from Portugal. It turned out that Rick had threatened him directly, promised to destroy his career and harm his family if he did not disappear quietly. Marcus had been too afraid to fight, too isolated to know who to trust. But when he saw the news coverage, when he understood that Rick had finally been brought down, he came home. He testified at the trial, filling in crucial details about how the fraud had been constructed and maintained. Last I heard, he was working for a cybersecurity firm, using his experience to help other organizations detect and prevent similar schemes. As for me, my name was completely cleared. The board conducted a thorough investigation and confirmed that I had been an unwitting victim, not a participant in Rick's crimes. I was offered my position back, promoted even, given leadership of the reorganized firm that emerged from the wreckage. I declined. Too much had happened in that building. Too many ghosts haunted those corridors. I needed a fresh start, somewhere untainted by the memories of what had been done to me and what I had been forced to do in response. Sarah and I moved to Edinburgh, where I started my own small consulting firm, building something honest from the ground up. It was not as prestigious as Thornton Blackwood, not as lucrative, but it was mine. Every client I served, every deal I closed, every success I achieved came from my own merits, unshadowed by a mentor who had only ever seen me as a tool to be used and discarded. Emma started school in our new city, making friends, thriving in ways that filled my heart with hope for the future. Sarah went back to nursing, taking a position at a hospital that valued her skills and treated her with respect. We built a life, not as grand as the one we had left behind, but more real, more honest, more ours. But the story does not quite end there. Because revenge, true revenge, is not just about punishment. It is about transformation. It is about taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it to become something better, something stronger, something the betrayer could never have imagined. About a year after Rick's conviction, I received a letter. It was from his wife, Catherine Thornton. I had not heard from her since everything fell apart, had wondered sometimes how she was coping with the destruction of her family. The letter was brief, carefully written, and it asked a simple question. She asked if I would be willing to meet with her, to help her understand what had happened, to give her some kind of closure. I almost said no. The wounds were still too fresh, the anger still too close to the surface. But Sarah convinced me that sometimes healing required facing the things you would rather avoid. So I agreed to meet Catherine at a quiet cafe in London, neutral ground for a conversation I dreaded having. She was older than I remembered, aged by grief and shame. She told me that she had known nothing about Rick's crimes, that the revelation had shattered her world completely. Her children had distanced themselves from her, unable to cope with the legacy of their father's actions. She had lost most of their money, seized by the authorities as proceeds of crime. She was living in a small flat in suburban London, surviving on a pension that barely covered her expenses. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not make excuses for Rick or try to minimize what he had done. She just wanted to understand. She wanted to know how the man she had loved for 30 years, the man she had thought she knew completely, could have been capable of such calculated cruelty. I did not have answers for her. I did not understand it myself. But I told her what I could. I told her about the Rick I had known, the mentor who had seemed so generous and kind. I told her about my own journey from blind trust to devastating realization to determined revenge. And I told her that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hide their true selves most completely. Before we parted, she gave me something, a watch, expensive and elegant, that Rick had given me on my 5th anniversary at the company. I had left it behind when I was escorted out, and somehow Catherine had kept it, knowing that one day she might have the chance to return it. I took the watch home and thought about what to do with it. It represented so much. The good years when I had believed the lie, the discovery when everything had shattered, the revenge when I had taken back my power, and now this strange coda, this moment of connection with another of Rick's victims. In the end, I sold it. The proceeds went to a charity that supports victims of financial fraud, helping them navigate the aftermath and rebuild their lives. It felt like the right ending for that particular chapter, turning something that had been given in false love into something that would help others recover from similar betrayals. But ultimately I told her I regretted nothing. Rick Thornton tried to destroy me, to steal my reputation, my freedom, my future. He treated me as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded, and I refused to let him succeed. I fought back with every weapon I had, and I won. That is not something to regret. That is something to be proud of. She nodded, something resolving in her expression, and thanked me for my time. I watched her walk away and hoped that she would never need the advice I had given her. But if she did, I hoped she would remember that survival was possible, that revenge, pursued carefully and ethically, could be a form of justice, that the people who try to destroy us do not always succeed. The last update I have about Rick Thornton came about 3 years ago. He was released from prison early, having served his minimum sentence and convinced the parole board of his rehabilitation. He tried to restart his career, leveraging old connections, calling in old favors. But the world had changed. The publicity around his conviction had been too extensive, the evidence of his crimes too damning. No one would touch him. Last I heard, he was living in a modest flat somewhere in the Midlands, cut off from his family, abandoned by his friends, stripped of the wealth and status that had defined his entire identity. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence, who had built empires and destroyed lives with equal ease, was reduced to anonymity and insignificance. Some might call that fate too lenient for what he did. The 14 years he served, reduced by early release, seems inadequate for the millions he stole, the lives he ruined, the trust he systematically betrayed. But I have made my peace with it. His punishment is not just the years behind bars. It is the complete destruction of everything he valued: his reputation, his relationships, his legacy. He spent decades building a monument to himself, and I burned it to the ground. That is enough. That has to be enough. Because if I spend the rest of my life consumed by thoughts of whether Rick Thornton has suffered adequately, then in a way, he wins. He continues to occupy space in my mind, to shape my thoughts, to control my emotional landscape. And I refuse to give him that power. So I have let him go, not forgiven him, never that, but released him from the central place he once occupied in my consciousness. He is a chapter in my story, an important chapter, perhaps the defining chapter, but still just a chapter. and I have many more chapters left to write. My daughter Emma is 15 now, brilliant and kind, and full of a confidence that fills me with hope. She knows the general outlines of what happened, the story of how her father once trusted the wrong person and had to fight to protect his family. She does not know all the details, not yet, but one day I will tell her everything. One day she will understand that her father was not always strong, was not always wise, but when faced with the ultimate test, he refused to break. Sarah and I celebrated our 20th anniversary last year. We renewed our vows in a small ceremony in the Scottish Highlands, just the two of us and a few close friends. She stood opposite me in a dress the color of autumn leaves, and I looked into her eyes and saw the same fierce love that had sustained me through the darkest time of my life. I told her that I owed her everything, that without her courage, her support, her unwavering belief that we could fight back and win, I would have been destroyed. That every good thing in my life could be traced back to her choice to stand by me when easier paths were available. She smiled and said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that I had it backwards. She said that what happened with Rick had revealed the man I really was, not made me into someone new. The courage, the determination, the willingness to fight for justice. Those things had always been inside me, waiting for the circumstances that would bring them forth. She said that Rick Thornton's greatest mistake was not the fraud or the manipulation or the attempted framing. His greatest mistake was choosing me as his victim, because I was not the grateful, blindly loyal puppy he thought I was. I was someone who, when pushed to the edge, would push back harder than he could ever have imagined. I cried when she said that. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of recognition. She saw me, truly saw me, in a way that Rick never had despite all his claims of mentorship and paternal love. He had seen a tool, a means to an end. She saw a human being, with flaws and fears and strengths he had never suspected. That is the difference between love and manipulation. Love sees who you are and helps you become more yourself. Manipulation sees what you can be used for and tries to shape you into something convenient. Rick never loved me. He used me. And when I stopped being useful, he tried to throw me away. But Sarah loved me. She loves me still. And that love was strong enough to survive the worst betrayal I have ever experienced, strong enough to carry me through the months of deception and planning, strong enough to help me build a new life from the ashes of the old one. I think about the young man I was when I first met Rick Thornton, 27 years old, desperate for opportunity, willing to believe the best about anyone who showed me kindness. That young man was not weak or foolish. He was hopeful, trusting, hungry for connection. Those are not character flaws. They are the qualities that make us human. Rick exploited those qualities. He took my hope and turned it into a weapon against me. He took my trust and used it to set his trap. He took my hunger for connection and fed it lies dressed up as love. But in the end, those same qualities were what saved me. My hope kept me going when despair seemed like the only rational response. My trust, directed toward the right people this time, helped me build the alliances I needed to fight back. My hunger for connection led me to Catherine Shaw and Marcus Webb and Victoria Ashford, the people who helped me bring Rick down. The lesson, I think, is not that we should stop trusting people. It is not that we should armor ourselves against connection, viewing everyone with suspicion, refusing to let anyone get close enough to hurt us. That path leads to a different kind of destruction, a slow withering of the soul that is its own form of defeat. The lesson is that we should trust wisely. Pay attention to the warning signs. Question the things that seem too good to be true. Build relationships slowly, testing them over time, watching how people behave when they think no one is looking. Trust is precious precisely because it makes us vulnerable. We should not give it away carelessly, but we should not refuse to give it at all. And when trust is betrayed, as it inevitably sometimes will be, we should remember that we have a choice. We can let the betrayal define us, turning us bitter and broken, or we can let it refine us, burning away our illusions and revealing the strength that was always there beneath the surface. I chose refinement. I chose to take the worst thing that ever happened to me and transform it into a catalyst for growth. I am not glad that Rick Thornton betrayed me. I would not wish that experience on anyone. But I am proud of who I became in response. I am proud that I fought back. I am proud that I won. and I am proud that I have been able to share my story with others who are facing their own betrayals, their own dark nights of the soul. If my experience can help even one person recognize the warning signs before it is too late, or find the courage to fight back when all seems lost, then something good will have come from all that pain. That is the final revenge, really. Not the conviction, not the imprisonment, not the destruction of Rick's reputation and legacy. The final revenge is living well, building something real from the wreckage, finding love and purpose and meaning in a world that once seemed utterly dark. Rick Thornton tried to destroy me. He almost succeeded. But here I am, 15 years later, healthy and happy and surrounded by people I love. I have a career I am proud of, a family that sustains me, a life that is genuinely mine. And somewhere in a modest flat in the Midlands, the man who tried to take all of that from me is living out his days in obscurity and shame, knowing that his greatest scheme failed, that his perfect victim turned out to be his perfect nemesis. There is a word for that. The word is justice. But there is another word too, one that feels more personal, more earned. The word is healing. Because revenge alone is not enough. If all you achieve is the destruction of your enemy, you remain forever defined by the conflict, forever trapped in the moment of betrayal. True healing comes when you can move beyond the revenge, when you can build something new that has nothing to do with the person who hurt you. I have reached that point. I still think about Rick sometimes, still feel the old anger stir when I remember what he did, but he no longer dominates my thoughts. He no longer controls my emotional landscape. He is a figure from my past, receding further with each passing year, while my present and future grow richer and more full. My boss turned into my enemy. That is the title of this story, the simple truth at its core. The man I trusted most in my professional life became the person who tried hardest to destroy me. But that is not how the story ends. The story ends with me, here, now, alive and thriving. It ends with the understanding that betrayal is not the end of the story, just a chapter within it. It ends with the knowledge that we are all capable of surviving things we never imagined we could survive, of finding strength we never knew we had, of building lives that the people who hurt us could never have predicted. Rick Thornton thought he knew me. He thought I was a simple person, with simple motivations, easy to manipulate, easy to control. He was wrong, and his mistake cost him everything. That is my story. That is my truth. And if you are out there somewhere, facing your own betrayal, questioning your own judgment, wondering if you will ever recover, I want you to know one thing. You will. You can. You are stronger than the people who hurt you, and when you reach the other side of this darkness, you will be amazed at the person you have become. My boss turned into my enemy, and I turned into someone who could defeat him. That is not just revenge. That is redemption.